Michael Fremer, senior contributing editor at Stereophile magazine, and I'm going to set up a turntable for you. How many of you have turntables now? Or good, that's always reassuring. But there's always a few people that are maybe thinking about doing it and want to see what's involved in this. So, okay, so we're going to set up. This is a Montegiro turntable from Germany. It's a turntable. It's a parfait. It's many different things, and it does everything. And we're going to set up a Graham arm, which I think is a really nice. I own this arm. It's a really good arm, and it lets you do all the different setup functions, which is what I want to show you. So that's what I've decided to set up. Now, normally, you're going to have an arm that's pre-drilled, and it's going to be sitting on a plinth, and you will not be able to move it like we can move this here. But before you set up your arm, you want to make sure that the person that drilled the arm board, I mean, if you're buying like a Riga where it's pretty much cut and dried, you're okay. But if it's an arm that's being mounted by a dealer for you, you want to make sure before you start this that he has drilled it correctly and that the pivot to spindle distance is correct. I did some setup seminars in Norway, and we used a triplanar, and there was a problem with the jig. And I said, make sure you check the pivot to spindle distance. If you don't have the Feickert tool, you can just get a plastic ruler and drill a hole at 0 inches and just measure the distance from the spindle to the pivot point and make sure that it meets the spec. That one was off. It turns out that there was a problem how it was drilled. It was a big embarrassment to everybody involved, but at least it proved that you really have to make sure that you have that correct. Now, before I set up a turntable, the first thing I do is I don't dress like this at home. In fact, I very rarely dress like this at all, but I take off anything that might get in the way of the stylus. A friend of mine flew in from Germany and set up a turntable for an executive for a record company and put in a Titan eye cartridge, and the guy went over to play his first record, and his mohair sweater caught the stylus and broke it off. So be very careful. I'm trying to take my tie off. It's the only drama you'll see in this whole thing. Take off watches, jewelry, anything else like that. And when you do this, make sure you do it in a place where you have a lot of open space. So if you drop a screw or a bolt, it doesn't roll under a radiator and you're lost. So do it someplace out in the open. Also, when you do it, make sure that you're in a good mood, because this can be really frustrating. So don't do it after you've had a fight with your wife, or in my case, I never watch Fox News before I do this. And just be in a good mood and realize that things can go wrong and it can be frustrating. But if you just follow the directions and do what you have to do, there's no reason why you can't get this set up perfectly. Indeed, there's no such thing as perfect setup. It's very important to understand that everything you're going to be doing here is a compromise in one fashion or another. And the idea is to just minimize the problems. If you really want perfection, get a CD player, because they are perfect, as we all know. So the first thing is, you've made sure your pivot to spindle distance is correct, so you know that whatever gauge you're going to use is going to work properly. So the next thing you want to do, also have a good light. Now, I didn't bring a flashlight. Usually I have a little flashlight. I didn't bring it this time, so I think the light's good here. Now, I can cheat with the Graham arm, and I'm going to cheat just for the sake of time. I can take the arm tube off, and it makes the installation that much easier. If you can't do that, you're just going to have to bend down and do the cartridge install however you have to do it. In fact, let me do it the hard way, because I don't know how many people have Graham arms here. So the first thing to do is take your cartridge. I'm going to install, I could have brought a cheap cartridge here in case I break it, but I didn't. I brought an older Lyra cartridge. It's still a very good cartridge, and that way if it breaks, there's some drama involved in this, because this can be pretty boring. So I have never broken one. In all the years I've been doing this, even as a reviewer, and the hundreds of cartridges that have probably come in, I've never broken one, luckily.
You could try it blindfolded if you wanted some more drama.
I'll do that at the end, okay?
What is the correct pivot to spindle?
Each arm is different, so that's why you have to know which arm is. Actually, one time I had taken my turntable apart. I had a Simon York turntable, which comes apart like this does. And I had reviewed another turntable, and I had sent it back, and I had no turntable set up. And I had some people over, and we were drinking margaritas, and then they all went home, and I said, I just got to listen to some music. And, I didn't want to hear a CD. So I went downstairs, and I was pretty trashed. And I set up the turntable with a Titan eye, and I nailed it. It was amazing. I was very lucky. Don't do that. Okay. And don't text while you set up your turntable. Okay, so the first thing is screw in, and I like to put it in just one at first so I can pivot the cartridge and have easier access to the pins. Now you'd think in all the years that we've been doing this, that there would be a standardization of the pin size and the clip size, but there isn't any. So it's very important that you make a really good contact. This is a real tight fit. So if you go to do this and it's loose, you're going to have to tighten it up. And if it's tight, you're going to have to loosen it up. So if you have to loosen it up, the best way to do it is with a round toothpick like this. You put it in the clip and just push a little bit. And if you have to tighten it, you want to use this also, because if you take a pair of pliers and just start tightening it, you'll probably squash it. So if you put the toothpick in there and then squash it, you'll only squash it as far as the toothpick goes, and you're not likely to have any damage. Try not to do this with your fingers. Try to get a nice pair of needle-nose pliers like this. I had one that had a hole drilled in there so that no matter how tight you squeezed it, you couldn't collapse the clip. And I traveled to Germany with it, and I was getting on a plane, and I had it in my hand luggage, and I had taken it in my hand luggage all over the place, no problem. But Lufthansa, she's opened her, you cannot take this on the plane. I said, why? It's a pair of pliers. I can't do anything with this. You cannot take it. Sign this piece of paper, and we take it from you. Otherwise, don't get on the plane. So I had to sign it away. Or I could have kept it and not gotten on the plane. It was ridiculous.
Nailed it in the post.
But anyway, so that one's gone. I'll have to make another one. So this is color-coded. Most cartridges are color-coded, and it's white and blue. White is the hot on the right channel, on the left channel, and blue is the ground. And my friend Ken Kessler said, the way you remember this is the left channel it's the Israelis versus the non-Jews, because the one channel is blue and white, which is the Israeli colors, and the other one is Christmas, red and green. What can I tell you? Blame it on Ken Kessler.
So the white's the right?
The white is the left. I misspoke. I am spatially challenged. I will tell you that. I am spatially challenged, and sometimes I'm sort of spatially dyslexic, and I'll say it exactly backwards of what I mean to say. So, this doesn't come naturally to me, but. And on the DVD, if you've seen the DVD, I mess up. I make mistakes as I go, and I left every mistake in there because I think the worst thing you can do is take this whole process, it can take an hour, and condense it down to 6 minutes, like in some of the instructions you've seen where they say, do this, fade, cross dissolve, do this. And you're sitting there an hour later, you've only done the first thing, and you say, how did they do it? Well, they cross dissolved. I'm not cross dissolving, so I do it all live, and screws fall and things happen, and I think that's the way you should see it because it can get very ugly. Okay, so now with that attached, I put in the second screw. Now, when a record is cut, it's cut in a straight line, and so the cutting head is tangential to the grooves that it's cutting. And ideally, you'd like to play it back that way. And there are arms that are called linear trackers, tangential trackers. In my experience, those arms have as many problems as they solve. There are all kinds of issues involved. I don't want to get into that unless you want to talk about it later, but there are problems involved in getting a thing to move across the record in a straight line. There are mass issues. There are issues of this kind of wiggle, and some of these arms that look like they're tangential trackers when you look at them from far away. If you were to get close up and really see what's going on, what's actually happening is the stylus is wiggling its way across the record and making little circles across, and is more tracking distortion that way than doing this correctly. That's my opinion. There are the people who say it's got to be a 12-inch arm, and there are people that say not a 12-inch arm. And I try to tell people that whatever it is you like, fine, but understand that there are advantages to a 12-inch arm and there are disadvantages. And there are advantages to a 9-inch arm and disadvantages. And the same is true of so-called linear tracking arms. Lots of disadvantages. Like if you use one with an air bearing. First time I got one of those, I said, this solves all the problems. There's no friction. It's perfect. But when the air has to get from the middle of the bearing where it's doing its work to the outside, where it's got to be at the ambient air pressure in the room, if you blow up a balloon and let it go, it's going to go woo. And what's happening right at that gap is woo, and the arm is actually doing this unless they find a way in the design to get the air pressure from high air pressure to ambient air pressure within that much space. The arm's going to actually be vibrating at a very high frequency. Now, some of the designers have managed to fix that problem, but a lot of them haven't. So if you see an inexpensive air-bearing arm, it's going to have that problem. But unless you delve into these details, on the surface, it seems as if, well, they've solved all the problems. And so keep that in mind. Anyway, so now I've got the cartridge on here. The first thing we're going to do is try to minimize the amount of tracking distortion. Since we can't track in a straight line, we're going to track in an arc that goes across the record. And a number of mathematicians, of which I guarantee you I am not one, have done the math. And they have figured out how to get this stylus to track an arc across the record and minimize the tracking distortion. And again, all of these mathematical formula are compromises. So there is the Beerwald, and there is the Lofgren, and then I've just discovered today the Stevenson. Most of these are designed to have the distortion creep up a little bit, get to what's called the null point, where there is no distortion, where the stylus is actually tangential to the groove the way you want it to be. And then the distortion creeps up some more, and then it goes away, and then it creeps up toward the end. The idea is that by spreading it out, your ear is never conscious of where the distortion is. And in my experience, if you set up an arm correctly with either of these geometries, you won't really hear, you shouldn't hear any distortion. If you hear distortion on playback of a record, it usually means you've got a problem in your setup. It's not because the system has that problem. There's more distortion added by other elements in an audio system, in my experience. Riga has a totally different setup procedure. They believe that since people listen to a lot of classical music where the end grooves are the modulated grooves, they have the minimal distortion on the inner grooves. So again, all three of these, however many there are of these, are all compromises, and you can try one and then try another. I'm agnostic about that. Sometimes I use the Beerwald, sometimes I use the Lofgren. Both of them work perfectly well. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is, now I've measured this pivot to spindle distance. I know it's correct. Also, you want to make sure your turntable is level. So get a bubble level. And this one is not level, and we can't level the table, and we can't level the turntable. It's reasonably level, but most turntables will have a way of leveling it. Make sure it's level before you start. I like to put the level pretty much where the record's going to play and make sure it's level there. And this is pretty good. The next thing you want to do is, if you have a felt mat or anything that's coarse, you want to get rid of that because you can ruin your stylus that way. This one is smooth, it's fine. And the next thing you want to do is somehow disable the platter from spinning. I have traveled around the world with these nice rubber wedges, and over time I've left all the rubber wedges around the world. And I don't know where to get any more because wherever I got them from, Rubber Wedges or us or wherever, but I'll find some. So I'm just going to stick a tissue in here, whatever it takes. There, now it's not going to move. Next thing I want to do is, obviously we don't know how this is set in terms of the tracking for us. We want to make sure we don't crush the stylus before we start. So however your arm works, back off the counterweight. Make sure your cueing device is down. And over time, I've learned pretty much, I've got to do one more thing. You know, the gram arm comes packed this way, and it's an inverted unipivot bearing, and it has a protective blue thingamajig on top of the bearing. There actually have been people so anxious to use their gram arm that they don't bother reading the instructions. They set it up with this on there, and then they complain, this thing's terrible, it doesn't track, it sounds horrible. So, when in doubt, read the instructions. Okay, so I'm just going to, this should track at about 175. Of course, it's going to change as I move the arm forward and back to find the proper place where the cartridge is going to go. I think that's about good. I really recommend getting one of these digital gauges. They're getting cheaper and cheaper all the time. They're down under $100. And you want to measure it at the record surface. This actually is raised up just enough to approximate where a record would be. So I'm going for about 1.75. I think I'm feeling it a little heavy. It's giving me trouble here. There we go. When this thing isn't in a good mood, it won't zero out, and then it won't work. So wait a second.
What's the gauge called?
It's a vertical tracking force gauge or a stylus pressure gauge. I'm a little heavy. Also, you don't want to set it too light. You want it pretty close to where it's supposed to be because the stylus is kind of a spring. So if you're tracking too light, when you do get the final proper stylus pressure, it's going to push the stylus forward of where you want it to be. And if you're too far forward to begin with, it'll move it back. So try to get it pretty close. So I got it about 1.7. That's going to be good. Okay, now I'm going to try this gauge for the first time. And it's this one with this hole?
Yes, that's straight under the...
This hole.
Yes.
Whose gauge is it?
This is Dr. Feickert's gauge. This is a brand new one. This is the right hole.
Final engineering sample.
Okay, so this is it like this. Okay. Now I don't need this in here anymore, so I'm just going to... I can...
Because you have to
This is...
aim straight to the...
Oh, that's right, that's
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
of course.
Otherwise you
How
don't get
foolish
it.
of me, of course.
You lost your tissue.
Oh, my God. You shouldn't touch that because I have swine flu. Now,
Really? Oh, me too. So
okay, we're good. Now, let me ask you this question. With this arm, you can't see the exact... We have to approximate it, correct? Because there's no...
Well, there's one thing we can do. You just removed the cap from it before, didn't you? May I show
Yeah.
you how I would do it on this tone?
How would you do it on this tone? See, I'm not opposed to being here and having someone else show me something, and
Oh, put
it's
it-
perfectly fine.
Remove this one, the cap.
And then you turn it over,
Exactly. That's
and
the way
luckily
we do
there's
it.
no
Then we block it.
no silicone in there.
It's not a big
So
issue.
you want to go right down into the
Exactly.
Oh,
Now
okay.
we need the
Okay.
pin. We
Okay.
go directly
Okay.
over the point.
There you go. Okay, that's good.
Okay,
Yeah.
then. So we can read out the pivot to spindle distance here. By now, it's supposed to be 215.5 millimeters on this tone arm,
Okay.
which is about approximately what Bob Graham is.
Well, I set that. I moved this to here because I
Yeah.
used the hole that he has.
I see.
That's how I did it
see,
on top
see.
of there,
Well,
which
maybe
is correct.
As far as I recall, the Phantom is 212 to 213, something like that. So we should move it a little bit towards.
Okay.
Yeah. But may I have a look?
Sure.
Sure. Look.
We should
to see.
remove the. I'll move this off here
No,
so
no,
you.
no, 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 leave-
You
leave-
think
leave
you'll be able to
place.
get it
Yeah,
over there?
That's fine. Yeah, yeah.
It's like two cooks. It's a bad scene.
Oh no, I think we get it aligned this way. It's
Okay.
perfect. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
it will work. Believe me. So
Okay.
what we do now?
So now I go to
we
there.
Take care that it doesn't turn
Move.
and move in any way anymore. So we go up here. This one back.
Okay.
This one back in place. There we go.
This arm has been used because the silicone is in
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And I think just before the end of the day we get the job done.
Okay. All of these steps would be the same no matter what arm that you have. So okay. So now the next thing I'll do is I'm going to try to get the tip of the stylus into
I would say
on that line.
position B. Yeah.
So just do it into B. We'll do it here, right?
Yes.
Step one.
The step one, exactly.
Okay. So I have to. I say I have
So
to
this
move
is
it.
the first step. You adjust for the overhang.
Right. Make sure your anti-skating
Yeah.
is turned off before you start any of this. Otherwise, the arm is going to slide all over the place. So it's not easy to disable it on this arm. And of course, I don't have a teeny tiny screwdriver to get this. So I'm just going to have to push this to minimum, and I'll work around it. But disable your anti-skating. Okay, so let's see where we are. We're way in front. Let me see how the VTA is too here. Okay. So now I have to move it back. And this could take a while. When you do this, you'll be moving it back and forth until you get it exactly correct. How's the cameraman doing? Is he doing an okay job so you can see? Okay, I think you.
Come from above.
Boy, it would be better to be on this side if you can get over there.
I think we could use also this wedge here, don't we, to plug it? So we plug it in here.
Yeah, that's good.
see what a USB stick.
Yeah, USB can be good for something in the analog world. You know, I lent this cartridge to somebody, and I got it back to do this demo, and I could see he collapsed the cantilever. Yeah, this is going to be fun. He didn't tell me he did that. I see. Now let's see what we're seeing up there. Maybe we should get this light turned out here. Speak up. Okay, do we know which one of these things it is over here? That's the garage door. Careful. Okay. 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 I'll be able to see what I have to do. Now let's see.
Let's see if I can see.
What's really bad is the stylus is definitely collapsed. So I'm gonna set it for the bare walled, which is the B. So it's got to be on that cross point. And I think for the sake of this, rather than me sitting here and doing all of these things until I get it exactly correct, especially since the stylus is collapsed, I'm just going to say that I move it until I get it so it's lined up with that line and on the cross point of where it says bare wall. There are other gauges like this one, which basically has a series of arcs that trace across, and you pick the one that's for your effective length tone arm, and you adjust it so it stays in the groove all the way across the arc. There are some kinds that have 2 sets of cross hatches. You've all seen those. And you pick one and set it, and then move to the other. And if it's off, you have to slide the cartridge back and forth till it sits in both. So I'm going to assume that I've got it in that particular spot. So that means I've got the overhang correct, and the overhang is just the distance that the stylus has to be from the pivot point. So that takes care of that. Now at that point, I can set the stylus pressure because it's not going to change. Now once you get that point set, you're going to want to tighten the screws. How tight? Some guys, they just keep tightening, and that's not a good idea. It just has to be reasonably snug, and do it a little bit at a time on each side, so you have an even amount. Do I have the gauge here? I didn't bring it. But I have a torque wrench that Riga makes that you stick it in there and you turn it until it clicks, and then you have a sufficient amount of torque on the screw. And they said, just keep turning it because you'll be surprised how tight you can actually make it, and it'll click, but just you keep doing that until it clicks and don't worry about it. So I'm turning and I'm turning, and all of a sudden I look and I see the whole top plate of the cartridge has liquefied and kind of spread across like melted butter. It was a defective torque wrench that they sent me. So they had to buy a new Crown Jewel SE cartridge for me. Hey, that stuff happens. Okay, now if you're using an L-shaped Allen key, don't hold on the end and turn. Try to hold it on top. That way you won't exert too much pressure on there. Okay. Now we have to adjust the zenith angle, and that is this angle, because now we've got the angle in terms of this distance. Now we have to make sure the offset angle is correct. And so for that, we're going to use step 2. There are going to be 2 null points. Now, in those 2 null points, it means that the stylus is going to be tangential to the groove, and that means that a straight line perpendicular to the groove or parallel to the groove will line up with the stylus. So now we turn this, correct? We turn it. We take out the USB drive.
We can take out the swine flu.
You don't want to touch that. It's bad news. Okay, so now we can turn this, and we're looking for the rear hash mark. And now, this is where I really want people to be able to see this.
Yep.
In fact, I want to be able to see it. Let me move the water out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. Anybody have a flashlight? like a little thing on their keychain?
Yep.
Could I? It really would be helpful if I could. Thanks. Let's see if that works.
There you go.
Beautiful.
Want me to hold it from this angle?
Boy, it's too bad the stylus is collapsing because you really can't see. Ugh. You know what I'm going to try doing? I'm just going to try lightening the stylus pressure way, way up. And that might, I know it's not the right thing to do in terms of getting this accurate, but it is really. Yeah, the show must go on, exactly. Well, that's not going to work.
Air bearing.
Okay, let's see. And you'd have to get, can you get lower?
Lower? Sure.
Yeah, it's really got to be at ground level.
Oh, okay. What would have caused the stylus to collapse?
Who knows what he did with it? He may have tracked it too heavy. He may have dropped it. It may just be that I've used this one. You know, I've done hundreds, well, not hundreds, but probably at least 50 to 60 of these demonstrations using this particular cartridge. Plus, it's old to begin with. This is a, I don't know if it's a Parnassus or a Clavis. I think it's the original Clavis. It's going to be.
From above.
It's going to be tough to see that. Oh. And can you do a macro focus now? We'll probably be right there. It's going to be pretty difficult, I think.
Yeah.
It's both because it's a collapsed stylus and, you know, in all honesty, this is a great gauge. I think it might be easier to see it on just to show on this. I think it might be easier to see it.
The problem is
The collapsed cartridge.
otherwise you would easily see them.
If I had a teeny tiny screwdriver, which I don't, I could take the body off of this, then you'd really see it more easily, which is what I'll probably have to do for tomorrow's. At any rate, when you do this with whatever gauge you use, there's going to be a hash mark. And so once you've got the overhang correct, there's the hash mark going in this direction has to be parallel to the stylus, and you're going to want to twist this so that the line and the stylus and the cantilever match up. If it's like that, it's wrong. If it's like that, it's wrong. At the null point, it should be lined up. I hope that's clear. It's as clear as I can make it. So if it's off a little bit, if you have to pivot around, if you have to move it in this direction, then you're going to want to loosen the outer one more and the inner one less, and that way you'll be able to pivot it without losing your overhang. I shouldn't have tightened it as much because I knew I had to move it. And if you have to go the other way, you do it the other way. Then after you finish doing that, you're going to want to go back and double check your overhang because in all likelihood you may have moved the overhang. You may have moved the whole cartridge forward or back. So you're going to want to go back to step one and make sure, well, you have to do this again, right?
Yeah, well, no, in this case, you simply can do it the other way around. Go on the crossmark, on the protractor, and see if the pin still is
Right, that's right.
point of the toner,
Right.
which gives you much more easy readout.
Right. So you can go back to your first step. Check it, make sure it's exactly on the cross mark. And then you can go back to what the proper reading is supposed to be here and make sure it's in the right place. Here it's not, but that's because everything got totally messed up.
No. This is step 2. For step 2, you don't have to.
Oh, it's step 1. That's right. Sorry. See, my learning curve is a little longer than some. It's a problem. Okay, now you can see it's, and then you go back to the proper pivot to spindle distance, which was 215.
There's a 250.
15.5, yeah. And then if that's correct and then this is correct, then you know you're correct. If it's sitting in exactly the right spot, and then you know the zenith angle is correct, then you're done with that. This is actually simpler than it seemed like just this time because of the collapsed stylus and using a new gauge for the first time. So I don't mind showing this because whenever something new comes into your life, that's what ends up happening. Okay, so now you've got the overhang set correct. You've got the zenith angle set correct. You've got the VTF set correct. I changed it, but I'm going to leave it that way. We'll make sure it's correct. Now, most of what you have to do is now done. Now, the next thing you have to do is set your anti-skating. Now, this is one of the most, I think, misunderstood aspects of this whole process. The reason why an arm skates across the record towards the center is not because of centrifugal force. It's because the offset angle of the head shell creates what the physicists call a vector force that makes the arm want to move in to the center of the record. So if you don't apply a counter force, an anti-skating force, then the stylus is going to run the whole way across the record on the inner groove, which you don't want. If you apply too much anti-skating force, it's going to pull back and run the whole way across on the outer groove. The idea is to get it so that it stays centered in the groove all the way across. The only problem is that the amount of skating you get depends upon the stylus pressure, the vinyl formulation, the modulation in the grooves, how heavily modulated the groove is. So there's no way to set skating exactly correct. There's no such thing. It's a compromise like all of these setups are. So what's the best way to do it? Well, I use this gauge, which will pretty much no longer be available. So I'm not sure I should even use this anymore, but I can show you how it works if you want to see what this does. This was a Wally gauge. And this was work done by a cartridge manufacturer that found the amount of anti-skating needed could be ascertained by using a hanging gauge like this. This could be a real cartridge wrecker. But I've never done it. There are some test records that I'm sure you've seen that, see what can happen, that have very highly modulated grooves, and I get emails from people saying, I set the anti-skating according to that test record, and I couldn't, it's still distorted. Well, that modulation in those grooves is way, way greater than anything you're likely to encounter, you will encounter in any record. So why worry about that? You're never going to encounter that. There was a great test record that Telarc once made that had a modulation in a groove that would get stronger and stronger and stronger, and there was a pilot tone on it. And at some point or other, either the left channel would break up or the right channel would break up first. So if the left channel breaks up first, that means that there's not enough anti-skating because the stylus is riding on the inner groove. If the left channel breaks up first, it means there's too much anti-skating. Did I get that right, or am I backwards with that? Well, one channel, okay, here's the groove. If it's riding on the inside channel, which is the right channel, if that breaks up first, that means you have too much anti-skating. If it breaks up on the left channel first, it means you have not enough anti-skating because it's running on the inside. And you adjust the anti-skating until both channels break up at the same time. But nobody makes that record anymore, and Telarc's no longer in business and they won't make it. So basically what you have to do is follow the instructions from your tone arm manufacturer. And usually what it is if it's a magnetic type, they'll say if you're tracking it 1.5 grams, set it at 1.5 notches. If it's 2 grams, 2. But I have found using this gauge, which is proven to be fairly accurate, and the Tellark record, that almost every manufacturer overstates the amount of anti-skating you need to use. So I would play it on the conservative side, and if you're tracking at 1.75 grams, I would set the anti-skating at the 1 gram notch, at the notch that corresponds with 1 gram. I find that less is more. I don't know what you find. And then listen, and if you find it breaking up on records, you can adjust the anti-skating and see if that solves the problem. With this gauge, we'll see how accurate Bob Graham has gotten his. You want it to be about 12 notches on this scale here, from that to the plumb bob, and right now it's about 11. And if I move this out one more, this is obviously something that consumers don't need to have, but I feel as a reviewer, if I'm reviewing a tone arm, I want to be able to tell readers how accurate the gauge is that the manufacturer supplies. So this is about 11. It's 11 things, and I'm on the first notch, which is about 1 gram. So Bob overstates it a little bit, but it's what I say. I would set it at 1 for about 1.75 grams. And that would be your anti-skating setup. Now the next thing you would want to set is your VTA, and this is another subject. There's a lot of confusion about this. There's vertical tracking angle and there's the stylus rake angle, and these are two things that are related to each other. In this system, there are 2 pivot points. One pivot point is back here, and one pivot point is right inside the cartridge, where the cantilever is connected at the back of the cartridge. So when you adjust your tracking force, when you increase it, you can see you're changing that angle, and when you decrease it, you're doing that. And since it's at this pivot point, which is much closer to the stylus, this actually has the potential for greater effect on the rake of the stylus going into the groove than does the back. And everybody's fixated on VTA. You have to raise the VTA on a 9-inch arm 4 millimeters to change the VTA 1 degree. That's a lot to change 1 degree. Whereas if you change the vertical tracking force a half a gram or 3/4 of a gram, you will have changed the stylus rake angle by a greater amount. Now, why is this important? When the record is cut, it's not cut straight down. It's cut on an angle. The cutter head acts like a sickle. It makes an angle. So unless you can get the stylus to reproduce that angle, you will get intermodulation distortion. So ideally, you would like to retrace that angle. The only problem is different thickness records will change that angle. Different cutting heads are different, and when they put the stylus cutter in the chuck, if it's not done exactly right, the angle can vary in the cutting head a number of degrees. So when you play back a record, if you want to fetish on this and spend your time marking every record you have and listening and getting it set. There are people that do that. I mean, these are people who have 4 records and play the same records over again. And that they don't listen to music particularly, but they are audiophiles. I don't do that. I get it set for an average record. I take a record I know really well, like Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, which I know really well. If you set the VTA, SRA correctly on that record, the horn locks in, the imaging of the instruments locks into place, the tonality of the horn, you'll know it immediately as opposed to when it's wrong. And I tend to leave it that way because it's a little bit off for records that are thinner, a little bit off for records that are thicker, and maybe a little bit off depending upon who did the cutting. But I can't be obsessed with every single record. So I used to say a good average place to start is with the arm parallel to the surface of the record. So I would put a record on, and I'd put the stylus in the groove. Also, never set your anti-skating. If somebody gives you a record that has nothing cut on one groove and says, this is a platform, put the stylus on that unmodulated groove and adjust the anti-skating so it doesn't move on that. Have you ever seen those records? Well, I just finished saying that skating is dependent upon the modulation in the groove. Well, if there's no groove in there, then what do that is so wrong. That's very wrong. So don't use a record like that. So what I would say initially is set it up so it's parallel to the record surface. If you don't have an arm that can adjust VTA, make sure you buy a cartridge that's compatible with that arm so it's approximately parallel. You don't want to install a cartridge where the arm's up like that or the arm's down like that in an arm that can't have the VTA adjusted. So normally I tell people, get a piece of a ruler like this and cut it off, or find something that has a gauge on it like just cross hatches, and then just look on the side and adjust the VTA so the arm is parallel to the record, and that's a good starting point. And this arm actually has a bubble level built right into it, and so you can easily adjust it so it's centered, which is a nice feature. And this was the common accepted practice to do this, and then lower it a little bit. Most cartridge makers will say a little lower than parallel, but I've been doing some reading, and there was an article published in Audio Magazine about 20 years ago called More Than One VTA. And that article suggests that the best place to set it for most stylus profiles is slightly up. And that puts the SRA at about 91 degrees, which is where you want it, with 90 degrees being with the shank of the stylus directly in. And they say it should point slightly forward of that, if you can see that. On the other hand, it also depends upon the stylus profile. I was talking to Peter Letterman from Soundsmith, and if you look at his style, it looks like it's way, way over the top. And so in order to get it to be 91 degrees, you'd have to back it way down. But he says that the profile of his stylus is such that it's an illusion that it looks like it's way, way over the top. And so he recommends parallel to the record surface. So again, all of these recommendations depend upon what cartridge you have and what the manufacturer recommends. And it would be better if manufacturers would give you a little tip sheet about where their particular stylus sits best in the groove for SRA. And then there was some reviewers say, well, this cartridge sounds much better tracked at 2.8, even though the manufacturer says the range is 1.7 to 2.2. And they're saying that it doesn't really make sense because you're taking the coil out of the sweet spot of the magnet structure. But on top of that, you're so grossly changing the SRA. Is it better because you're tracking better, or is it different because you're changing the SRA by a great degree? So anytime you read about someone saying, try tracking it at 2.8 or 2.9, even though the recommended force is 1.75, without telling you to raise the arm up like 6 or 7 millimeters to compensate for the difference in the SRA, I wouldn't do that. Okay, so now there's one last thing that has to be adjusted on some arms, not every arm, and that's the azimuth. And this is another aspect of this that's seriously misunderstood. There's a test record that tells you, play the test tone, connect your arm out of phase, and mono it, and then adjust the azimuth, which is this angle. This is the stylus in the groove, which is this angle, which would be this. Adjust it so that there's no sound coming out of the speakers, and that's how you set azimuth. But that is not setting azimuth. That's balancing the electrical output of your stereo system, which is a totally different thing. The idea of setting azimuth is to minimize crosstalk between the channels. When you minimize crosstalk between the channels, you maximize your sound stage. And when you maximize your separation and equalize the amount of crosstalk, you get the biggest sound stage and the most stable imaging, and the differences are dramatic, even a slight difference. Now, you can adjust it. The most primitive way of adjusting it is to put a reflective surface on the platter and look from the front and adjust the azimuth, if your arm has azimuth adjustment, until it looks like it's perpendicular. And that is the bare minimum way of doing it. But if you measure it electrically, as you're going to find out right now, that really is not adequate to do this. And there are two ways of doing this. The one way is before Dr. Feickert invented his software was, I'll explain this way to you. It's cumbersome, but it works if you don't want to use his software. But his software is great. I couldn't live without it at this point. You would get a voltmeter and get a test record where it has one channel modulated at 1K for a few minutes, and then the other channel modulated at 1K for a few minutes. Get some earplugs, set the voltmeter for volts, put it in the output of your amplifier, play the modulated channel, turn the volume up till you get about 4 volts, and it's going to be pretty loud. And then while that channel is playing, move the probes to the channel that's not playing, and you'll get another voltage. It'll be a much, much lower voltage. And you write that down. So you've got a big voltage and a small voltage. Then play the other test track that modulates the other channel, and play the channel that's modulated, and it should be the same 4 volts approximately. And then quickly switch it over to the channel that's not modulated, and you'll get a much lower voltage. And the voltage is going to fluctuate because there's going to be low frequency rumble. If you have a rumble filter you can put in, that would help. But you're going to approximately get this large voltage and small voltage. And then there's a chart that will convert the voltage to decibels. And this chart happens to be on this DVD in the PDF file. And you would read, let's say you had 4 volts, comes out to about 52 dB. And if on the small reading you got was, say, 0.15, it's 24 dB. Then you would subtract the 24 from the 52, and you'd have the separation on that channel. And you do that for both channels, and you would see what the separation is for the both channels. You should at least get it so that the difference between the separation in the 2 channels is 10% or less. You'll never get it exact. If you get it to 10% or less, you'll have maximized your separation and minimized the difference in the crosstalk between the 2 channels. That's one way of doing it. Now for the real way of doing it, Dr. Feickert will take over.
So first of all, thank you for the introduction on my software. As Michael already told you, azimuth setting is a very critical thing on cartridges. Consider the stylus. Oh, excuse me.
Leave it on the other side. You can leave you alone.
Consider a stylus to be a very delicate piece of equipment, very small, tiny thing, digging through the grooves of the record. So if you don't get it in the proper placing, it needs to be tracking the record properly. You cannot only damage the stylus, but your records. Why? Consider a, let's say, spherical stylus. By default, they have a radius of 15 microns. Where does this come from? 15 microns times 2 is 30 microns, which is the least width of a cut groove on the record. This is by default, it's international standard. You will not find any record cut below these parameters. So, but we nowadays use elliptical styli, which have a much more larger surface that they touch in the groove, okay? And setting this not perpendicular simply means you increase the one surface and decrease the other. So the applied force increases over the touched area on the one hand, and the pressure applied to the smaller area increases and simply causes additional wear to the record. But this is not the only complaint I have about not proper set azimuth. What you also lose is channel separation. As Michael told you before, it's getting you into the problem that you lose imaging, stability, and layering of the soundstage. So what we did some, let's say, theoretical thoughts, or put in some theoretical thoughts on how to get this solved. There are different methods that are published on the internet that you can read. Simply say cancel out, or let's say put one channel out of phase, the other one in phase, and cancel it out. And as Michael already told you, this is simply balancing the output of left and right channel, which is not set, or let's say equivalent to perfectly set azimuth. How can you do it? We have developed this software that makes your life easier so that you do not need to measure with a voltmeter, but it simply collects the information, starting to read out the stereo track at 1 kilohertz, 0 dB, which means a speed, a velocity of 11.3 centimeters a second for the stylus. Then we have left channel only, collecting information of the crosstalk on the right channel. Then on the next track, we have right channel only, collecting the amount of crosstalk on the left channel. But not only the amount, we do need, because in some cases, and I will show you some of these cases, you will not be able with this data to set proper azimuth. What else can we do? Everybody of us knows that it's not only the pure value in decibels, what makes the music, but also the phase. So if you're complete out of phase, you have no image at all. it's completely one cloud over the whole room, the whole soundstage. You cannot get any image, and you have complete in phase. And everything in between gives us additional information from the ear to the brain. Where is the placing of the different sources? And this is how music is recorded. So, what did we do? We adapted this system and said, okay, we also detect the phasing of the unwanted signal in correlation to the wanted signal. And this is what our software does. So, the good thing, when you launch the software, you see this first screen. You have azimuth crosstalk, you can set for proper speed, you can analyze the speed settings of your turntable, you can measure the frequency response of your cartridge together in union with the phono stage. You can measure lateral and vertical resonance frequency of the tone arm and the cartridge. Very crucial thing. You can measure harmonic distortion, you can measure tone arm resonances, and you have general measurements. By the way, this is the Pro version, as you can read on the left-hand top. The home version we offer doesn't have these last three tasks. It's limited to azimuth, speed, frequency response, and resonance frequency. That's pretty much it. And this is what most customers do need. So, unfortunately, I cannot make a real-life demo by now. It would take us something like 20 minutes, which is not that much, but I simply explain how you do it. On this Bram tone arm, we have a very nice cueing device where we can set for azimuth.
Right.
So you can screw up and down as it's magnetically stabilized and simply rotates the tone arm in itself, so it applies azimuth. Azimuth is the angle here, okay?
You can do it if you want, you can just turn it on.
Yeah, well, we can turn so that you can see where it should be out of the armrest.
Don't worry about that cartridge.
Not anymore, not anymore. So you see, it simply rotates clockwise or counterclockwise. We recommend to measure at least 5 points, being starting at +2 degrees, +1 degree, 0 degree, which is the geometrical perpendicular position, -1, -2 degree. This is the least set of measurements you need to get a good estimate of what the correct azimuth angle of your cartridge really is. If you want to do it the absolute proper way, you need to go in 9 steps. So you start 2, 1, 5, 1, 0, 5, 0, up to -2. To show you the results, what is happening. By the way, this is an Autophone Rondo bronze cartridge.
Did you tell them about that, the bubble level and the sound card? You know, just so
I will do that at the end, so
Okay.
that first of all get the facts and then
Okay.
what needs to be done to get all those results. What you now see, there's a table with numbers. Left to right, right to left. There's an angle, 157, 90 degree, and so on. And you also see here, azimuth angle -2, -1.5, ending up at +2. So this is nothing else than a spreadsheet. And numbers don't tell you anything. You want to see what we're talking about. So you go on the visualize button here, press on it, and now we see the real thing, what's going on. This is the amount of crosstalk from left to right and right to left versus the azimuth angle. You see, you go lower, 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 lower at a certain point of +0.5 degree, which is ½ degree counterclockwise. They go again over there. And you see we start at around -25, and at the perfect point we have a balance of -36 dB. So setting azimuth properly puts us into the position that we gain an additional 11 dB in channel depth separation. That's a magnitude, isn't it? Above you can see the read out figures of the phase information of the unwanted signal in correlation to the real signal on the channel we want to listen to. and you see the intersection appears exactly at the same point where the crosstalk levels intersect. So in this case, where would you put your cartridge? Which setting? I think it's obvious. You can see it. Now I show you another set of results. Same cartridge, same tone arm. By the way, this was a linear tracker. It was a Kusma airline tone arm. And it was set to the appropriate level that we thought to be correct. So geometrically, it looked perfect. You put the bubble level on top and you see it's level.
What's interesting about this is it shows you that if you set it so it's visually perpendicular, you're going to lose a lot of separation.
Especially here. It's not only the separation, but also the phase difference. The phase difference, which really affects the human ear. I can show you a set of measurements and results that show huge difference in phase information. And this really, you will recognize immediately, because it simply narrows the soundstage, and the layering, the staggering to the depth is getting much more less. It's flat. It's flat.
And you relax more when it's set right, because our whole evolution is based upon the phase differences annoying when things are coming after us. And so when the phasing is exactly correct, the sense of relaxation when you listen to records becomes that much greater.
Exactly. So, what did we do with the next step? Okay, we increased the VTA by 3 millimeters. Exactly the same setup. We didn't change anything, only VTA. Let's see what this looks like. Look at the crosstalk. Look at the crosstalk. Cancelling gives you perfect results from 1 to 2 degrees. You cannot say which is which. It always gives the same result. And also, it's hard to tell which would be the perfect point. You don't get it anymore. There's no point. But look at the phase response. Still it intersects at the same amount of azimuth. Okay? Now we do to the next level. You see, now we have an intersection at a little more than 81 degrees. And I go back to the first set of measurements, and you look where the phase response intersected at that point. Can anybody tell me? Around 62. So going up with VTA, we had intersection beginning from the initial point of level, of physical level, at 62 degrees roughly. We went up by 3 millimeters, went to a little more than 80 degrees, and then we simply hit it on the spot, applying an additional 4 millimeters, which results in something like 1 degree, as I said before. Yeah? We applied an additional 1 degree, and look at the results right now. Look at the crosstalk. They are going in parallel. There's no intersection anymore. But phase still intersects at the same amount of azimuth applied to the cartridge. And it intersects at which degree? Roughly 90, huh? So this was the position, because we also listened what we did. This was definitely the position you would love to have. You get the best trackability. We tested it with our test records. This cartridge with this setting was capable of handling 110 microns. It's specified to handle 80. It easily does 110 without any distortion. Okay? This was a reasonably priced Autophone cartridge, and it sounds amazing. But consider you using the cancellation method to set azimuth. Tell me which is which. No way.